अब प्रधानमंत्री रवाना हुए हैं पापुआ न्यू गिनी के लिए। प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी एशिया प्रशांत क्षेत्र के देश पापुआ न्यू गिनी जाने वाले भारत के पहले प्रधानमंत्री हैं और ये दौरा भी बेहद अहम है। प्रधानमंत्री इंडिया पैसिफिक आइलैंड्स कोऑपरेशन समिट।
Prime Minister Narendra Modi is now leaving from Hiroshima in Japan. He had meetings with some of the most important leaders across the globe over the past 3 days. Prime Minister, in fact, also spoke about the fact that this is not an era of war, and also emphasized that if one talks about climate change, then it is the developed nations who, in fact, need to give assistance to the developing nations. If no assistance is given, if the technology transfer does not take place, then according to Prime Minister, the talk about climate change will remain only talk, and there will only be discussions that will be taking place. Prime Minister met UK PM Rishi Sunak also and held bilateral meetings. It seems like Prime Minister's meeting with Rishi Sunak will now be paving way to make sure that all the wrinkles are ironed out in the free trade agreement. Prime Minister also held a meeting with the United States President Joe Biden, and the kind of bonhomie that both of them shared is now paving way for Prime Minister's visit to the Washington DC that will take place in June. Prime Minister, those visuals that you see, Prime Minister Narendra Modi leaving Hiroshima in Japan now, and Prime Minister is now en route to Papua New Guinea. Prime Minister held a very fruitful meeting. The 3 days that he was in Japan, he met Zelensky and he spoke with the Ukrainian president and gave him assurance that India will do everything in its power to make sure that there is a resolution in sight for the Ukraine and Russia war. Prime Minister also spoke about the fact that one really needs to give food security to the globe, around the globe. Our External Affairs Editor Geeta Mohan is now joining me on the phone line. Geeta, it seems like the last 3 days were very fruitful for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the kind of talks that he has had with the top leaders, pointing towards the fact that Prime Minister believes that India can actually help in solving some of the key issues.
Well, absolutely. India is an important player in ensuring and in any conversation that has to do with global peace, global supply chains, freedom of navigation, security, architecture of various countries. And in that, we saw not just a Quad meeting, the G7, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke about the Global South and the fact that Global South is impacted the most when it comes to conflict, when it comes to climate change, and when it comes to supply chains being affected, be it energy or food. So Prime Minister Modi's statements were very, very important and crucial, but it was the bilateral meetings and the meetings on the sidelines of the G7 Ashwarya, which were key and more important. The bilateral meetings with not just the G7 leaders, but particularly with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, for the first time was important, where a message went about on how there needs to be peace, and it is, and the war in Ukraine, according to India and the Indian Prime Minister, is not just about war, but it's also about humanitarian crisis that has unfolded in Ukraine, in the captured territories, and in the border areas of Ukraine and Russia. So that certainly was an impactful statement and a lot of takeaways from this visit of Prime Minister Modi. He's headed to Port Moresby to Papua New Guinea, where it's not just a bilateral visit that's important. Papua New Guinea plays a very significant role in how the West is looking at these Pacific nations and Pacific Island nations and China's footprint or foothold in these parts of the world. He's not only going to hold bilateral meetings there, he's also co-hosting the Forum for India and Pacific Island Countries Cooperation, that's PIPIC, where he will be hosting it for 14 Pacific Island nations who have confirmed participation, Ashwarya, and that is going to be of great significance we'll see what the outcome and the takeaways from that meeting and from that visit is going to be, after which he'll be going for a bilateral annual visit to Australia.
Right, Geeta. Geeta, one of the most important things that the Prime Minister spoke about, he said that India will be hosting the Quad Summit next year. So that also is something crucial that the Prime Minister spoke about in Japan.
Ashwarya, could you please repeat the question?
Summit next year. So that was also one of the important announcements that were made by Prime Minister.
Your voice is breaking, Ashwarya. Could you please just repeat the question once more?
Can you hear me, Geeta?
Yes, I can.
So, Geeta, the Prime Minister announced that India will be hosting the Quad Summit next year. So that was also one of the important announcements made by the Prime Minister.
Absolutely. That's a very important announcement. Although this year the Quad Summit was to be hosted and was to be held in Australia. And it could not happen in Australia because President Biden had to pull out last minute. He's traveling back from Japan to the United States of America for a domestic crisis. And that's the reason why the Quad leaders met in Japan when the opportunity presented itself, with all the leaders being there for the G7 summit. India is the host of the Quad next year, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced it yesterday during the Quad forum.
Thank you, Geeta, for giving us all those details. Our External Affairs editor talking about the fact that this was a very important visit for Prime Minister Narendra Modi and also for India at large. Now, the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, James Marape, will personally welcome Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the airport when he arrives today. Now, the country does not typically provide a ceremonial welcome for leaders who arrive after sunset, but there will be a special exception that has been made for Prime Minister Narendra Modi.